Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome if you're joining in for the very first time. The purpose of this show, this entire show, is to share tips and tricks, lessons learned, best practices, sometimes not so best practices, ideas and insights on anything SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solution. And I don't just talk about and share technical tips, because most technical professionals are drawn into the technical implementation, the strategy. I want the strategy, I want the implementation, I want the technical details of the how. There's a lot of documentation out there from Microsoft. There's a ton of articles and blog posts, YouTube videos that does that. And what I find interesting is that a lot of the content out there focuses only on the technical aspect, without realizing tech is just one piece of the entire puzzle when we are looking at high availability and disaster recovery. And so I want to share kind of like the things that most technical professionals sometimes brush off because they don't see it as valuable as the technical skills and the technical implementation. This episode, last week I started off this series called Inherited Disasters, where I kind of started off with a premise that you're new in the company, you're starting out, you're maybe a consultant, you're being brought in for this brand new client, and you have no clue. You just parachuted in, and now you're responsible for making sure that everything's stable, reliable, and highly available as well. So I started with this series last week on Inherited Disasters series, where I kind of gave you the framework of what to do in case you were given the responsibility to take care of something that is a disaster. Maybe somebody built the infrastructure. They built it without clear understanding or without the awareness of what a high availability solution needs. Maybe they built a failover clustered instance and not following recommended best practices from both the hardware, Microsoft, a storage vendor point of view, or maybe consultant came in, built it, and then left. And then now you have no clue about what to do with it, or anything for that matter. I've seen cases where a senior engineer built everything from the ground up. He's the only one who knew about it. But then the evolution of the platform with innovations, with upgrades, with modernization, all of a sudden it no longer looks how it looked like the first day it was built. But again, because he's the only person who knew about it and then left, everybody's clueless. So we start off with the premise that you are inheriting something and you have no clue. Okay, and upon your first week, your first few days, you kind of knew that it was a disaster. Meaning they are having issues after issues. And it is tempting as technology professionals to jump in immediately and fix the problem. Again, that is the worst thing that you could ever do, because you'll never know, unless of course it's an emergency situation, you need to step in and fix it. But we have this tendency to immediately jump in, fix problems or fix issues when the issues are not causing any problems. Because again, we are trained, and that's the very reason why we get hired as technology professionals. Fix issues. But we have to learn the art of dealing with pressing issues, like an outage situation, a problem that's causing business disruption, and something that is indeed not according to best practice. It is a massively designed horribly wrong. It is configured, not misconfigured, but they're not causing any issues. And so last week, or in the last episode, I introduced this concept called the A.R.T framework. Okay, and throughout the remainder of this entire series, I'll be talking about every single letter in the A.R.T framework. I kind of gave like a broad overview of what the A.R.T framework is for But let's start with the letter A. A is the assessment. Okay, when you step into a new environment, you're brand new in the company, or a consultant, or a vendor, and you need to take care of it immediately. You're being given the responsibility, you're taking care of it before you even make drastic changes, even though they're justified, even though they would bring value to the business. Start or apply the A.R.T framework and start off with the assessment. And this is not just your typical assessment where you run a bunch of scripts to do a technical assessment. Okay, and this is again something that I've fallen into myself when I was working as a database administrator, systems engineer, as well as in my early years as a consultant. I come into an environment, every new customer, I would go into technical assessment mode. I would run scripts. Okay, I would assess the entire environment to figure out what's wrong. Right? Even though I already knew there's something wrong, I need to validate. Okay, and I've learned this by observing Microsoft field engineers. Very first exposure with the Microsoft Premier Field Engineering team was way back 2005 or 2006. Working as a data center engineer, we had a Premier Field Engineer assigned to us, and first day he would run scripts, or he would make us run scripts to do an entire assessment, technical assessment of the entire environment. And I kind of thought, wait, if Microsoft's doing this, then it's safe to actually do it, right? And so in my early years as a consultant, I would get brought in to a new customer environment and start, hey, can you run these scripts? I want to do an assessment. It starts off with a SQL Server instance, or if it's a high availability solution, all of the SQL Server instances as part of the high availability solution. And then based on the output, the result of the script, I will do kind of like an assessment of what the script found out based on is the configuration right? Is the setup properly done? Are there any configuration that does not follow best practices, or not my best practices, but vendor recommended best practices? And so this is kind of like my initial approach. But then as I learned along the way, even though Microsoft does this with their Premier Field Engineers, with the way they do this, I kind of realized that, wait a second, there's risk associated with simply running an assessment without understanding what the business is actually doing and why they want to do this assessment. It's easy. You look at your favorite search engine. You type in SQL Server assessment, best practices. There's a ton, hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of services that are being offered. And when you look at every single one of them, it starts off with, let's run an assessment, a technical assessment. Typically, it's a technical assessment. It's either a T-SQL script, a PowerShell script, or an app that they built to do an assessment. But what a lot of these assessments miss is what the business actually needs. Okay? And understanding what the business needs becomes your advantage. You start off with understanding what the business needs. It becomes your biggest advantage as a technology professional because it raises you above what most technology professionals do. So let me break it down in more detail. What kind of assessment beyond the technical assessment? And again, you still have to do the technical assessment. It's just that you don't start with a technical assessment. So let's start off with the first assessment. What do you assess for? You assess for compliance. That's the very first thing that you have to do. And for this, you don't really have to run any scripts for a while. You start off with asking questions. One of the things that you have to think about now with data sovereignty and with data governance, even if you're in a single region, for instance, in maybe Europe or maybe in the United States, or maybe in Asia Pacific, there are certain regulations about how the data needs to be dealt with. And as technology professionals, again, when we're looking at data, we're looking at the database, we're looking at the database server, we're looking at our network. Sure, because that's the only thing we have access to. But you have to start thinking about, and you have to start doing assessment for compliance, because as technology evolves, regulation also evolves as well. When I started out, this brings me back to when I was working as a data center engineer. We were the cloud, working for a large technology company. We were the cloud even before public cloud infrastructures ever existed. And the mere fact that we have a data center in one country, in one city, does not necessarily mean that whenever we're building a disaster recovery site, we just build one, different country, different city. We also have to consider the client's or the customer's requirements as far as data sovereignty is concerned. I think I can talk about it at this point. But this was the early days of data compliance requirements like the HIPAA and PCI compliance. And we had a customer where one of their business units is in one country. And so I was based in Singapore. We had a data center in Singapore. That business unit, and we're talking about one customer, one global customer, where they have different business units across the globe. The data for that specific business unit for their specific country need to reside, according to governance laws, need to reside within that country. Therefore, we cannot just move data from the data center inside this database server for this business unit, even though part of our disaster recovery process is taking the backups and ship it offsite. We had to create a process where the databases and the data for that business unit stored in this specific country does not leave the country. And with the evolution of regulations like 3 years ago with DORA in the EU, it will keep evolving. And so one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, am I compliant, or is our environment compliant? You might be thinking about, wait, I thought this was all about high availability and disaster recovery. Sure, but what about when you're building a disaster recovery solution? For example, I want to build a distributed availability group. I've got traditional availability groups for my high availability, and then I will copy transaction log records over my disaster recovery site, and I'll use distributed availability group. Sure, but what about data compliance? Are you shipping the data? Are you configuring your secondary AG in your disaster recovery site to be in compliance with how data sovereignty is applied as per your industry, as per your business requirement, as per compliance reasons? Yeah, it's easy to overlook that, again, whether you're dealing with availability groups or even log shipping or even disaster recovery solutions, products like Zerto, you have a disaster recovery site and you are copying the data, your entire infrastructure from production to DR. Is the DR environment compliant as far as data governance and data sovereignty rules are concerned? And this is something, again, this is something that when we look at high availability and disaster recovery, backups, again, going back to basics, backups, we're generating backups, we're copying them over to storage media, we're shipping the backups to DR on storage media. How compliant are you? And we're not even talking about, again, different technologies here. We're just asking the question, how is my data compliant? Because it's easy for you to start looking at, let's run some queries, let's query these DMVs, let's run PowerShell scripts against a SQL Server instance and look at it from a technical point of view. The thing is, with the technical issues, you can deal with that. yourself. If you don't have the skills, you can learn the skills to have to deal with that. But what about compliance issues? Maybe some of the data that you need to be taken care of are not compliant as far as, again, data governance, data sovereignty is concerned. Who needs to fix that? There are cases when, let's say you're working for a managed services provider and you have customers in different parts of the world, different states, different provinces, different countries, where you cannot access the data unless you're in that country. Or even if you're using VPN, you have to be physically in that country. Doesn't have to be in the same location as the customer's data, but you have to be in that country for data sovereignty purposes. That you cannot fix. Okay, so you have to do a compliance assessment on the data in and of itself, asking questions like, do we have data governance and data sovereignty requirements? Or for compliance and security, like, do we have HIPAA or do we have PHI data? And are these compliant with those requirements? Okay, and the thing about this is you can proceed to do a compliance assessment without even touching the servers. You can ask for architecture diagrams. First week on the job, you can ask for architecture diagrams. You can see and map out where the servers are, where the data is. Are they in the same country, same region, and do they have laws and regulations? And this is, again, this goes above and beyond you as a database administrator or technical professional looking at the technical implementation. And that's why I said in the beginning, this would raise you to a level above what most technology professionals do, because they're, most of the time, again, I'm guilty of this myself earlier in my career, where I would focus on the technical details. I'm just concerned about the technical details. But now I'm looking at, wait a second, this company is operating in this industry, and this industry has certain regulations. Are we following these compliance and regulatory requirements with the existing data? We're not even looking at future data, but existing data. So stuff like, do we have compliance on data at rest? Because even if you configure TDE with availability groups and you're copying the data to a different data center, you still have to make sure that you're following those regulatory compliance requirements. So you don't really need to run scripts for this, even in the first couple of weeks on the job. You can look at architecture diagrams, look at network configuration. Again, as database administrators and even systems administrators, you can talk to your network guys. Or with your, let's say you have a disaster recovery environment and somebody else is managing that, you can ask your co-location facility about how they're protecting the data, if they're the ones taking care of that. Now, in public cloud infrastructures, of course, it's a completely different story, because it depends on whether or not you're under certain country or regional regulations, and then you have to pick and choose certain sections or certain provisions within a public cloud infrastructure. It's one of the reasons why there's sovereign cloud for all of these different public cloud vendors. Okay, and again, these are things that could potentially cause issues when you're looking at legal issues that could potentially put the company in danger. Again, back in the days when life was easy, you don't really have to think about this. But again, things and laws and rules and regulations have evolved. The technology has evolved as well. So simply implementing a technology solution like, again, an always-on availability group or third-party backups is no longer enough. You have to think about, okay, I'm protected, but am I also compliant? Okay. What else? You assess for security. I've kind of hinted this when I mentioned a thing about PCI or HIPAA or PHI, or any type of security and regulatory compliance, depending on the industry and depending on the nature of the industry that you're in. Legal and healthcare have very strict rules about HIPAA. Legal, I forgot the regulation for that. Finance, highly, highly regulated, where you have to really think about everything end to end, from data ingestion up to data archiving, even to a point where if you want to archive your data, let's say you have a specific regulatory requirements to keep data within 7 years, then 7 years, older than 7 years, you have to archive that. Even the process of archiving, even the process of, let's say, destroying hard drives or replacing hard drives. Okay, there's a process. There's a requirement to properly discard storage, digital storage media like hard drives. Are you following those? It's not enough nowadays to just have availability groups for your high availability and maybe log shipping. Companies are now incorporating different security mechanisms. Like for instance, isolation with contained availability groups. You can now do isolation for different availability groups, which means you are giving access to only the databases in the contained availability group instead of having access to everything. Much like how a platform as a service or software as a service implementation is, where you have isolation per customer. Are you secure? And you might be thinking, wait, this is a security professional's job, not mine. But keep in mind, the only reason why security exists is to protect the most important asset. People, of course, I believe, are the most important asset in every organization. But second to that is the data. Okay, the reason why you're building this massively large infrastructure, you're building apps, you're building, the very reason why you have a digital infrastructure in the first place is you're protecting the data. And so from a security point of view, you really have to secure from data ingestion, from the app to database, data transfer when it comes to building a high availability and or disaster recovery solution that requires that, like log shipping, availability group, data replication, data processing. Like if you're doing an ETL process, are you securing that? What about giving production data to your developers and refreshing the development environment? Do you have a process in place to mask the data so that the developers don't accidentally expose that data as they're improving the app, building features for the app? These are things you have to consider. Okay. What about least privilege? Is the application using a login that has very minimal privilege and not sysadmin? Yes, I still see applications out there where, and we're not talking about classic ASP applications that were built 20 plus, 30 plus years ago. I'm seeing applications, modern applications with modern development frameworks still using an account that has sysadmin privileges. Please, as a database administrator or somebody who's responsible for the data, push back on any requirement that would require more than what is necessary. Push back. Okay? Data security is not just the job of, or security in general, it's not just the job of the security team or the compliance team or the regulatory team. It's the cybersecurity team. This is the job of everybody in the company. Okay? So again, from the beginning part from the ingestion part of the data, the collection, to the processing, to distribution, to archiving, the entire data lifecycle management, you have to secure the data. Even data at rest, even your backups, are they secure? Backup encryption is an option that you can enable in SQL Server for that. But again, those are strategy. But before you even look at strategy, ask the question, are we implementing security principles like least privilege or defense in depth? Are we implementing that in our data estate? okay? Or even keeping your entire infrastructure modernized. Like, when was the last time you applied a security hotfix? And I know I don't recommend that you immediately install the latest cumulative update, because, again, that's a risk in and of itself. Like the very recent CU1 for SQL Server 2025, when it was released, it broke some of the functionalities within SQL Server, like database mail, and that could be a risk, right? But you can wait until that has been stabilized, issues fixed, but you cannot afford to be waiting on a security incident before you apply the latest security hotfix, both for SQL Server or for your Windows operating system, or anything that touches the data. Okay, and again, I can spend an entire day talking about this, because I don't consider myself as a security guy. However, my belief has been security is not a title. It's not a job description. Security is a state of mind. And unless you look at the data that you're managing as an asset that you also need to protect, then you're at the risk of compromising the data. Okay? So assess for compliance. That's the first one. Assess for security. The third one is assess for HADR. Wait a second. We're talking about HADR here, right? Yes, of course. But the thing is, what I refer to as assessing for HADR, we're not just looking at, hey, is the availability group healthy? When you look at the dashboard, everything's healthy. We're looking at how much data has been accumulated, how large are the backups, how long does it take for you to restore from those backups, and are you still meeting your recovery point and recovery time objectives? Imagine starting out with only 5 databases in your available groups. Now you got like 50. Now the failover time, of course, is going to be a lot longer than when you only had like 5 databases, because again, assuming all things being equal, compute resources, storage resources, now you've had more threads, SQL Server threads, processing both the send queue and the redo queue, but now with more databases. So how has your high availability and your disaster recovery evolved, and are they still meeting your recovery point and recovery time objectives? So again, for availability groups, is the failover time, when was the last time you tested the failover time? When was the last time you restored your backups? And do your backups, restoring them, do they still meet the recovery time objective? The recovery point objective for your backups, sure, you're covered with the frequency of the backups, but what about restoring them? Let's say your entire SQL Server instance went offline, mistakes, and users making mistakes, we as humans making mistakes, dropping a table, restoring from backups. How long does it take to restore a 5 terabyte? I wouldn't know unless I test. Okay, so you assess for your HADR. Configuration drift is also a thing, where you would switch configurations based on resolving current issues. And I did mention, especially when you're brand new on a job and you're brand new with the environment, it's easy to jump in and start fixing issues, but make sure that you, I don't want to say hold back, but you prevent yourself from immediately fixing those issues, unless of course it's an emergency situation. Now, in an emergency situation, you would have to make changes. You would have to do stuff that are sometimes unreasonable, because the goal is to fix the issue, address the outage ASAP. And sometimes those actions might not be reasonable. Like one case that I worked on a couple of years ago, where I had to ask for a USB stick, plug it into the server so I can create a second log file. There's no reason for you to have a second log file for your SQL Server databases, because SQL Server is never going to write into that, unless, in this specific case, one-off case that I don't recommend, unless you ran out of space because your disk is full and SQL Server can no longer write transactions. So I had to ask for a USB stick, plug it into the server so that I can create a new log file. And that's an unreasonable action, but it warrants having a secondary log file just so I can keep the database up and running. An emergency situation like that. But in addition to configuration drift, where the configuration is no longer according to your internal best practice or Microsoft recommended best practice, sometimes you're putting your databases at risk. One customer that I worked with a couple of years ago, they had their availability group in manual failover. Synchronous commit, but manual failover. I kind of asked the question, wait a second, I don't really understand. You have a 2-node failover cluster with a 2 replica availability group. You have a witness, the failover cluster has quorum, so technically the failover cluster can automatically failover. But their availability groups are not configured with automatic failover. It's configured with manual failover. So I asked the question, why is your availability group not in automatic failover? It took them quite a while to come up with an answer because they have to go back to like tickets and requests and change requests and all this documentation to figure out why. And this is something, again, that could potentially cause issues with your HA and DR, because again, even though the failover cluster can do an automatic failover, but if the AG is not configured with automatic failover, you lose the node, then your AG is going to be offline until you step in and manually bring the AG online on the remaining node. But in their case, it took quite a while. There was an incident a few weeks before I saw the environment, and a few weeks before that, there was an issue that they had to resolve, that they had to switch the failover mode from automatic to manual, but they forgot to switch it back. And that's why you have to constantly do this, re-evaluating. And we're only talking about the technical aspects here. We're not even talking about, hey, what about your DR site? You're running it off of a co-location facility. What's their commitment like when it comes to invoking DR? Do they have a certain SLA? What kind of contracts did you sign when it comes to their SLA providing you with a service when you need to invoke DR? What does that look like? How are you evaluating both your RPO, RTO, and SLA? Okay, and these are all non-technical that you can evaluate and assess. And in my Practical SQL Server High Availability and Disaster Recovery online course, I flesh this out in more detail because there's so many things that you have to consider. But again, you assess for high availability and disaster recovery. So we looked at 3 things. You assess for compliance. Is your data environment compliant when it comes to your industry, the business that your company is in, the regulatory requirements and compliance requirements for the industry, as well as for the country, or as well as for the region where your country is in. Then you assess for security. Minimal privileges or least privileges, defense in depth, the security from the time you acquire the data, you ingest the data, to processing the data, backing up the data, archiving the data, copying the data from production to staging or development, all of these things. You assess for security. And of course, the last one is assessing for high availability and or disaster recovery, making sure that your databases, your entire high availability and or disaster recovery solution still meet your recovery point objective, recovery time objective, and your SLA. And all of these you can do even without running scripts. It's easier, of course, when you run scripts, but all of these are non-technical, meaning you can start probing, you can start asking questions, you can start looking at documentation to see whether or not you're compliant you're secure, and you are highly available, and you're protected for any form of disasters. Of course, that's just the first part. What do you do once you realized after doing these assessments without even touching the servers? Once you've reviewed the documentation, what do you do next? And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next episode. We are going to be looking at the letter R of the A.R.T framework. So make sure that you watch out for that. Right? That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Tune in again next time for another part of this series called Inherited Disasters. And if you do need help with anything related to SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery, maybe you need guidance on building a high availability solution, you need to evaluate different technologies and features, and your team is not well versed on in that technology. I was just talking to a database administrator yesterday, and she was moving to a different company where even large companies, we're not talking about startups, large enterprise companies are not really clear on how to properly implement high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. And it's one of the reasons why they keep encountering and experiencing problems like outages and misconfiguration and performance issues. Reach out, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. And this will lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. In the I call it the strategy session. We'll get clear on the challenges, the issues, or the goals that you want to achieve. Okay, part of that's really doing an assessment of where you're at, challenges and the problems that you're experiencing and issues. And then the second part of it is the strategy part, where we're going to map out strategies that would help you either prevent issues, address issues, problems, and challenges, or even with your staff to get them ready to support whatever high availability solution that you're implementing, or they need help with keeping the lights on and making sure that the entire infrastructure is stable, reliable, and highly available. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and I'm more than happy to help in any way I can. All right, that is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Tune in again next week for, I want to say, part 3 of this entire series called Inherited Disasters. I'll see you again in the next episode.